14 drones. That's all it took. On the night of March 25, 2026, the sky above Haifa, Israel's largest commercial and naval port, turned orange. Not from fireworks, not from a training exercise, from jet fuel, burning. The Israeli military confirmed the strike hours later. Iranian drones had penetrated one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the eastern Mediterranean, and they didn't just hit infrastructure, they hit a fuel depot servicing Israeli Air Force warplanes. They hit a naval maintenance facility, central to Israel's Mediterranean logistics chain. The port of Haifa, valued at over $5 billion, was still burning when the sun came up. This was not a random attack. This was a message, written in fire, delivered at almost no cost. But to understand why 14 drones could do this, you first need to understand exactly what they were targeting, and why that target was chosen years before the first drone ever left Iranian soil. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Haifa port actually is. It is not simply a place where cargo ships dock. Haifa handles approximately 40% of Israel's total seaborne import volume. It is the entry point for military equipment, energy supplies, and commercial goods, sustaining a nation of nearly 10 million people. The port hosts naval vessel repair and manufacturing facilities. It houses aviation fuel storage, directly connected to Israeli Air Force logistics in northern Israel. The week before this attack, an Iranian ballistic missile had already struck the Haifa oil refinery complex, with Israeli sources confirming the damage. This is the second confirmed strike on the same strategic node in under 7 days. That is not a coincidence. That is a targeting pattern. And the weapon Iran chose to deliver this pattern, the Shahed drone, was not chosen by accident either, because the Shahed was never really just a drone. It was an economic trap, and Israel walked straight into it. So how did 14 drones penetrate Israeli air defenses? The answer is not technical superiority. It is economic asymmetry, and it is deliberately engineered. Each Iranian Shahed 136 drone costs approximately $35,000 per unit. The Patriot interceptor missiles used to shoot them down cost around $4 million per shot. Do that math slowly. Iran spends roughly $500,000 to send 14 drones. Israel and the United States spend upward of $56 million to stop them. If only half get through, the equation still devastates the defender's economy, far more than the attackers. The Shahed 136 flies low, crosses the horizon late, and is hard to see, meaning radar acquisition happens too late for clean intercept windows. After supplying thousands of Shaheds to Russia for use in Ukraine, Iran watched how Moscow deployed them and brought those exact swarm tactics back to the Middle East. The swarm is not about each individual drone succeeding. The swarm is about overwhelming the defender's decision cycle. By the time operators prioritize targets, some drones have already arrived. And at Haifa on March 25th, the ones that arrived hit exactly what Iran wanted them to hit. But what, precisely, did Iran want to hit? And what does that targeting list reveal about a strategy that goes far deeper than one burning port? The targeting selection at Haifa was not random. It was surgical in intent, if not always in precision. Iran's army explicitly confirmed it had targeted the Center for Manufacturing and Maintenance of Naval Vessels, facilities central to Israeli Navy logistics in the eastern Mediterranean, alongside fuel storage depots, directly supporting Israeli warplane operations. Israel's Navy depends on Haifa for maintenance and repair of its SAR-class missile corvettes, the backbone of its maritime deterrence posture in the eastern Mediterranean. Disrupting their maintenance pipeline does not destroy the fleet overnight, but it degrades readiness. And in a sustained conflict, readiness degradation is cumulative. On the air side, fuel storage disruption forces the Israeli Air Force to reroute supply chains further south, increasing logistics complexity during active combat operations. Every additional hour of logistics overhead is a window for more strikes. Iran is not trying to win a single battle. Iran is trying to erode Israel's warfighting machine from the edges, slowly, methodically, at a fraction of the cost. And what makes this strategy genuinely alarming is not just what it does to Israel's military. It is what it reveals about the fragility hiding inside every single piece of critical infrastructure that modern militaries depend on to function. Here is what the Haifa strike reveals about the nature of modern military infrastructure. The port of Haifa was protected. Iron Dome batteries operated in the region. Radar networks were active. The Israeli military had been on heightened alert since February 28th, the date the United States and Israel launched strikes that killed Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei, triggering this entire escalation. And yet the drones got through. Since the conflict began, the UAE's air defense systems engaged over 1,600 Iranian drones, and 65 of them still caused damage to infrastructure. An intercept rate above 95% sounds impressive, until you understand that 95% is not 100%. And in critical infrastructure, refineries, fuel depots, naval facilities, the 5% that gets through is the 5% that burns. The vulnerability here is not a failure of technology. It is a structural vulnerability, inherent to any system that concentrates strategic assets in predictable, fixed geographic locations. Haifa port has been in the same place for decades. Iran has had decades to study it, to map it, to calculate exactly which building, hit at which angle, causes the most cascading damage. The strike on March 25th suggests that calculation was already complete. And once you understand that Iran had completed that calculation long before the first drone flew, the chain reaction that followed starts to look less like a military incident and more like the first domino in a sequence that was always meant to travel far beyond Haifa. The fire at Haifa port did not stop at Haifa. The first domino, Israeli insurance markets, coverage premiums for shipping through the eastern Mediterranean, spiked within hours of the strike being confirmed. Cargo operators began rerouting. Some diverted south toward the Suez route via the Red Sea, itself still unstable. Waiting means supply chain delays. Supply chain delays in wartime mean shortages. The second domino, fuel dependency. The strike on aviation fuel storage in Haifa forces the Israeli Air Force to draw from reserve depots further inland. Resupply under active strike conditions is exponentially more dangerous. The third domino, naval posture. With the naval maintenance facility damaged, Israel's eastern Mediterranean patrol schedule will require adjustment. The IRGC is already targeting the Strait of Hormuz, threatening bases across the Gulf, and using drone swarms to pressure regional energy infrastructure simultaneously. A degraded Israeli naval presence opens a corridor. Hezbollah resupply from the sea becomes marginally less constrained. The fourth domino, the psychological signal. Tehran framed the operation as a direct response to U.S.-Israeli claims that Iran's missile and drone capabilities had been significantly degraded. In other words, Iran hit Haifa to prove it still can. That signal is aimed not just at Israel. It says the degradation narrative is false, the capacity is intact, and the targeting is precise. But here is the part that the headlines are not telling you, because the reaction from the world's major powers to that signal reveals something far more unsettling than anything that happened at the port itself. The reaction from major world powers was predictable in form, but telling in substance. Washington did not immediately announce a significant escalation in response to the Haifa strike. After over 80 IRGC retaliatory strike waves since late February, the threshold for what constitutes significant escalation has shifted dramatically. Military analysts now describe two simultaneous air wars. One high altitude, where U.S. and Israeli jets are winning by suppressing Iranian air defenses and striking leadership, and one low altitude, where Iran's Shaheds are dominating by targeting bases, infrastructure, and economic nodes. The United States is winning the war it prepared for, but Iran is fighting a different war, a low war, a cheap war, a war of attrition, measured not in territory, but in economic cost, civilian anxiety, and alliance sustainability. Moscow watched all of this with quiet interest. Iran's drone doctrine, born from the battlefields of Ukraine, has now been demonstrated against a NATO-aligned adversary in real time. Every lesson learned here feeds back into future conflicts. Beijing watched too. The cost exchange ratio at Haifa, $35,000 in versus tens of millions in defensive spending out, is a template, and templates travel. What no one is saying loudly yet is that this template is already beginning to redraw the entire strategic map of how the world will defend ports, refineries, and military bases for the next 50 years. The Haifa strike may mark a structural turning point in how the world thinks about port security. For decades, the assumption was that major ports in allied nations operated under a defensive umbrella sufficient to deter drone attacks. That assumption is now operationally contested. Iran's drone strategy is fundamentally about forcing adversaries to expend expensive interceptors against cheap weapons, a dynamic that is structurally unsustainable over extended timelines. Ukraine's experience offers a partial blueprint, a multi-layered anti-drone defense combining mobile intercept squads, electronic warfare, and purpose-built interceptor drones, achieved an interception rate above 80% against Russian Shaheds. But 80%, as Haifa demonstrated, still means fire. The global insurance, logistics, and energy industries are now recalculating risk models for any port within Shahed range of an active conflict zone. That range, depending on variant, reaches up to 2,500 kilometers. At that radius, the threat envelope covers Cyprus, Crete, and reaches toward the southern Adriatic. Every port, every refinery, every naval facility within that circle is now inside a new risk category, a category that did not exist in this form 5 years ago. And behind every one of those risk calculations, behind every insurance spreadsheet and logistics reroute, there are people whose lives are being quietly, invisibly, and permanently rearranged. Behind the satellite imagery and the strategic calculus, there are people, workers at Haifa port, who did not know the night of March 25th would look like this. Northern Israeli residents who have spent weeks cycling in and out of bomb shelters, families in Iranian northern provinces, East Azerbaijan, Gilan, Golistan, grieving losses that the IRGC explicitly referenced in its own strike dedications. One journalist described a growing bunkerization taking hold in major Gulf cities, civilians increasingly sheltering from a sustained, indiscriminate drone onslaught affecting residential neighborhoods and tourist zones alike, civilians in Kuwait, civilians in Dubai, civilians in Bahrain, and now the port workers of Haifa. The machinery of strategic signaling does not move through empty space. It moves through neighborhoods, through refineries where people work night shifts, through ports where ships are being loaded at midnight. The drones do not distinguish. And if the trajectory of this conflict continues, if the doctrine holds, if the cost math keeps working, then the question is no longer whether another port will burn. The question is which one and when. 14 drones. Iran launched them to prove a point. The point was proven. The fuel is still burning. But here's the question that no one in any defense ministry has fully answered yet. If 14 drones can penetrate the air defenses of one of the most heavily protected ports in the Middle East on the 82nd retaliatory strike wave of a conflict that was supposed to degrade Iran's capabilities, then what happens when Iran launches not 14 drones, but 140? What happens when they are Arash-2s, weapons with 2,000-kilometer range, 150-kilogram warheads, and thermal signatures specifically engineered to evade the radar systems, defending the ports, refineries, and naval bases of America's closest allies? The fire at Haifa port will eventually go out, but the doctrine that lit it, the logic of asymmetric attrition, of cheap weapons bleeding expensive defenses, of infrastructure targeted not to win a battle but to exhaust a war, that doctrine is not going anywhere. It is, in fact, just getting started.